Given the jury's guilty verdict and your evident lack of remorse for this heinous crime, you are hereby sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. May God have mercy on your soul.
On December 17, 1995, in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia, 28-year-old Lisa Adams and her best friend, 29-year-old Cole Mills, were found brutally murdered in Lisa's Victorian-style home on East Gaston Street. The victims had been stabbed multiple times in what investigators initially described as one of the most violent crime scenes they had encountered in the genteel southern city, known more for its oak-lined streets and antebellum architecture than for heinous violence. Lisa's body was discovered in the living room, while Cole was found in the adjacent hallway, suggesting he may have attempted to flee or confront the attacker. Both victims had defensive wounds on their hands and arms, indicating they had fought desperately for their lives before succumbing to their injuries. If you're enjoying this true crime analysis, please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light, examining the complex circumstances and seeking understanding where there often seems to be none. The timing of the murders suggested the killer knew the victims' routines, as Lisa and Cole traditionally spent Sunday evenings together, watching movies or playing board games, a tradition dating back to their high school years. Nothing appeared to be stolen from the home. Lisa's purse contained cash, and valuable electronics remained untouched, immediately causing detectives to question whether the scene had been staged to appear as a robbery. Blood spatter analysis revealed the attack began in the kitchen and continued throughout the front of the house, with evidence suggesting the assailant had pursued both victims as they attempted to escape. The crime scene suggested personal rage rather than random violence, with the number and depth of stab wounds indicating what veteran detectives called overkill, an emotional attack far beyond what was necessary to cause death. The neighbors reported hearing what they thought was an argument around 9:30 p.m., followed by a period of silence, but no one called the police, as such disturbances were not entirely uncommon in the area where college students often rented homes. The bodies weren't discovered until the following morning when Lisa's roommate, Melissa Jenkins, returned from a weekend visit to her parents' home in nearby Brunswick and found the front door slightly ajar. The temperature in Savannah had dropped unusually low that December night, with a rare frost settling over the azalea bushes and magnolia trees that lined the historic district, which helped forensic technicians determine the approximate time of death. The winter chill had preserved the crime scene in ways that would later prove crucial when new forensic technologies became available decades later. Detective Lucas Moore, a 15-year veteran of the Savannah Police Department's Homicide Division, arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of the initial call and immediately recognized the significance of what he was seeing. The position of the bodies, the pattern of blood spatter on the walls and furniture, and the absence of signs of forced entry all pointed to someone the victims knew and trusted enough to allow into the home voluntarily. Physical evidence collected from the scene included fingerprints, blood samples, believed to be from the perpetrator who likely cut himself during the frenzied attack, and several strands of hair that did not match either victim. Detective Moore, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail, carefully documented every aspect of the crime scene, unwittingly preserving evidence that would remain dormant in police storage for decades before technological advances would make it useful. Lisa's parents, Richard and Margaret Adams, were contacted at their home in North Atlanta and made the devastating drive to Savannah upon learning of their daughter's death. Cole's mother, a widow living alone in nearby Richmond Hill, collapsed upon hearing the news and had to be hospitalized briefly for what doctors described as shock and acute stress reaction. The families were devastated not only by the loss, but by the apparent brutality of the crimes, with Richard Adams telling reporters at the time, "Whoever did this is a monster walking among us." Within hours, photos of Lisa and Cole dominated local news coverage, their smiling faces contrasting sharply with the grim details of their deaths being reported by solemn-faced anchors who struggled to maintain composure while delivering the news to a community unaccustomed to such violence. Investigators initially interviewed dozens of people connected to both victims, including colleagues, former romantic partners, and friends, creating an extensive list of potential suspects based on relationships and possible motives. Dustin Moss, a mutual friend who had known both victims since high school, was among those questioned in the initial round of interviews, but provided what appeared at the time to be a plausible alibi, claiming he was attending a Christmas party in Charleston, South Carolina, on the night of the murders. The alibi was cursorily checked by contacting two people Moss claimed were with him, both of whom vaguely recalled his presence at the gathering, but couldn't provide specific times or details, which investigators at the time deemed sufficient to move on to other leads. This cursory verification, later revealed to be woefully inadequate, represented one of several critical missteps in the early investigation that would delay justice for the victims for nearly a quarter-century. The medical examiner's report, completed 3 days after the murders, revealed additional disturbing details about the nature of the attack, including the fact that Lisa had been stabbed 17 times while Cole had suffered 12 stab wounds, with the fatal strikes to both victims targeting major blood vessels in the neck. The report also indicated that the killer likely used a single-edged hunting knife with a blade approximately 6 inches long, though the murder weapon was never recovered despite an extensive search of the area surrounding the home, including storm drains and nearby Forsyth Park, where it might have been discarded. Toxicology results showed that both victims had consumed moderate amounts of alcohol, consistent with their Sunday tradition of sharing a bottle of wine while watching movies, but not enough to significantly impair their judgment or ability to defend themselves. By the end of the first week of the investigation, police had developed several theories, but no strong suspects, and the case was already beginning to cool as leads dried up and witness memories faded. A candlelight vigil held in Forsyth Park drew nearly 1,000 mourners, including many former patients of Lisa, who worked as a pediatric nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital, and students of Cole who taught history and coached basketball at Savannah High School. Among the mourners, standing toward the back of the crowd with a solemn expression, was Dustin Moss, who briefly spoke with local reporters about his shock and grief, describing Lisa and Cole as the best friends anyone could ask for, and expressing hope that police would soon catch whoever did this terrible thing. His presence at the vigil, captured on local news footage, would years later be viewed by prosecutors as evidence of his calculated effort to appear appropriately grieved while deflecting suspicion. Lisa Adams was born on March 12, 1967, in Atlanta, Georgia, the only daughter of Richard, an accountant, and Margaret, an elementary school teacher, who described her as a compassionate child who always rushed to help injured classmates on the playground. She excelled academically throughout her school years, graduating near the top of her class from Grady High School before pursuing a nursing degree at Emory University, where her professors noted her exceptional bedside manner and intuitive understanding of patient needs. After completing her education, Lisa chose to move to Savannah rather than return to Atlanta, drawn to the coastal city's charm and slower pace, as well as the opportunity to work in the pediatric ward at St. Joseph's Hospital, where she quickly became beloved by both her young patients and their worried parents. Her colleagues at the hospital described her as the nurse they wanted caring for their own children, patient, kind, and meticulous in her attention to details that could make a frightened child feel safe in an unfamiliar environment. Cole Mills was born on November 8, 1966, in Richmond Hill, a small community just outside Savannah, to James and Eleanor Mills. with James working as a civil engineer and Eleanor as a librarian at the local public library. Following his father's untimely death from a heart attack when Cole was just 16, he took on additional responsibilities at home, while maintaining excellent grades and captaining his high school basketball team, demonstrating a maturity beyond his years that impressed teachers and coaches alike. After graduating from the University of Georgia with a degree in history education, Cole returned to the Savannah area to teach at his alma mater, where he was known for making historical events come alive for his students and for spending extra hours helping struggling teens improve their grades. He lived in a small bungalow not far from the school, which often became an informal gathering place for students seeking academic help, or simply a safe space to discuss their problems with an adult who treated them with respect and genuine interest. Lisa and Cole first met as children when both families attended the same church in Atlanta before the Mills family moved to Richmond Hill, but their friendship truly solidified during a summer camp when they were teenagers, bonding over shared interests in classic films, board games, and community service. Despite attending different colleges, they maintained their close friendship through regular letters and phone calls, with Cole often driving to Atlanta to visit Lisa during their university years, and their bond only strengthened after both settled into their adult lives in Savannah. Their friendship was a constant source of stability in both their lives, with Sunday movie nights serving as a sacred tradition that rarely got canceled despite their busy professional schedules and dating lives. Friends and family members often speculated about whether their relationship would evolve into something romantic, but both Lisa and Cole insisted they were perfectly content with their platonic bond, often joking they were family by choice rather than blood. Neither Lisa nor Cole had serious romantic partners at the time of their deaths, though Lisa had recently ended a brief relationship with a fellow nurse, who, according to friends, had become possessive and called her excessively. The ex-boyfriend was quickly cleared by police after establishing he was working a night shift at a hospital in Jacksonville, Florida, on the night of the murders, with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. Cole had been more focused on his career than dating, though he occasionally mentioned to close friends his interest in a fellow teacher at Savannah High, but had not yet worked up the courage to ask her out formally. Both victims were described by those who knew them as having wide circles of friends, but few enemies, making their violent deaths all the more perplexing to investigators who struggled to understand who would harbor such rage toward two widely beloved community members. Lisa's apartment, where the murders took place, was a second-floor unit in a converted Victorian home in Savannah's historic district, featuring original hardwood floors, tall windows that let in abundant natural light, and a small balcony overlooking a courtyard filled with camellias and azaleas. She had decorated the space with a mixture of antique furniture inherited from her grandmother and colorful artwork collected during her travels, creating a warm, inviting environment that reflected her vibrant personality and appreciation for beauty. Her roommate, Melissa Jenkins, a physical therapist who often worked weekend shifts and was therefore rarely home during Lisa and Cole's Sunday gatherings, later told investigators that Lisa had seemed somewhat distracted and anxious in the weeks leading up to the murder, but had dismissed Melissa's concerns, saying only that she was dealing with some old baggage that needed sorting. This comment, initially overlooked in the early investigation, would take on profound significance decades later when the case was re-examined with fresh eyes. Cole's students at Savannah High created a memorial display in the school's main hallway, featuring his photographs surrounded by handwritten notes describing the positive impact he had made on their lives, with several former students later establishing a scholarship fund in his name for graduates pursuing careers in education. His basketball players, many from disadvantaged backgrounds, spoke of how Coach Mills had served as a father figure, often providing rides home after practice helping them with college applications and even paying for team meals from his own modest teacher's salary when some players couldn't afford to contribute. The principal described losing Cole as like losing the heart of our school, noting that attendance and academic performance in several classes declined in the months following his death, as students struggled to cope with the loss of a mentor who had believed in their potential and pushed them to excel. Lisa's work with pediatric patients had included establishing a program that brought therapy dogs to the children's ward once a week, an initiative that significantly reduced anxiety among young patients facing frightening medical procedures. Her colleagues at St. Joseph's Hospital continued this program after her death, naming it Lisa's Comfort Companions in her memory, with the program eventually expanding to serve all departments of the hospital and becoming a model for similar initiatives throughout the Southeast. Parents of children she had cared for shared stories of how Lisa would sit with their children long after her shift had ended, reading stories or simply holding a scared child's hand, demonstrating a level of compassion that transcended professional obligation and touched countless families during what were often the most difficult moments of their lives. The joint funeral service for Lisa and Cole was held at the First Baptist Church of Savannah, with so many mourners in attendance that hundreds had to stand outside listening to the service through speakers set up on the church lawn. Both families requested that Lisa and Cole be buried side by side in Bonaventure Cemetery, beneath the sweeping Spanish moss of Savannah's most famous burial ground, acknowledging the deep bond that had united them in life. The joint headstone, a single piece of marble with both their names, featured a quote from Lisa's favorite poem, "True friendship multiplies the good in life and divides its evils," a sentiment that those who knew them felt perfectly captured the supportive relationship they had shared. At the funeral, Dustin Moss served as one of the pallbearers for Cole's casket, a role that would later be viewed with disgust by investigators who came to believe he had literally helped carry his victim to the grave while maintaining a facade of grief. Friends described both Lisa and Cole as people who saw the best in others, sometimes to a fault, with several later speculating that this quality might have made them vulnerable to someone they trusted but should have feared. Lisa's mother recalled during a later interview that her daughter had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around a male friend approximately 2 months before her death, but had quickly changed the subject when pressed for details, saying only that she was probably overreacting and would handle it herself. Cole's closest colleague at Savannah High similarly remembered him appearing troubled after a phone conversation about a week before the murder, overhearing him say, "I'll back you up no matter what." But Cole had declined to explain the context when asked about it later, saying only that he was helping a friend through something complicated. These fragmented conversations, seemingly insignificant at the time, would eventually be pieced together by investigators to reveal a disturbing pattern that pointed directly to Dustin Moss's mounting panic, as he feared exposure for past misdeeds. The 911 call came in at 8:37 a.m. on Monday, December 18, 1995, with Melissa Jenkins's voice trembling as she told the dispatcher, "I just got home and my roommate and her friend are... Oh God, there's blood everywhere. I think they're dead." The dispatcher kept Melissa on the line until police units arrived at the East Gaston Street address 4 minutes later, finding her sitting on the front steps, visibly shaking, and unable to re-enter the apartment where she had discovered the bodies of her roommate and Cole Mills. Officer James Thornton was the first to enter the crime scene, later describing in his report the overwhelming metallic smell of blood and noting that the living room looked like something from a horror movie, with furniture overturned and blood spatter covering the walls, floor, and even the ceiling in some areas. His body camera footage, which would be preserved in the case files and later used during the trial, captured his careful movement through the apartment, documenting the positions of the bodies and the apparent struggle that had taken place throughout the front rooms of the residence. Detective Lucas Moore arrived with the forensic team at 9:15 a.m., immediately establishing a perimeter and ordering officers to canvass the neighborhood for potential witnesses, while the crime scene technicians began their methodical processing of the apartment. The victims' bodies remained as they had fallen. Lisa face down in the living room near the television that was still playing static, and Cole crumpled in the hallway leading to the front door, suggesting he had attempted to escape or perhaps draw the attacker away from Lisa. Moore's initial assessment, dictated into his recorder as he surveyed the scene, noted, "The violence here suggests not just murder, but rage. Someone knew these people and wanted them to suffer." The detective's 23 years of experience, including 15 in homicide, told him immediately that this was no random break-in or robbery gone wrong, but a deeply personal attack fueled by intense emotion, a theory supported by the multiple excessive stab wounds documented by the medical examiner and the complete disregard for valuable items left in plain view throughout the apartment. Among the first evidence collected was a partial bloody fingerprint on the doorframe between the living room and hallway, several strands of hair found clutched in Lisa's hand, suggesting she had grabbed at her attacker, and blood droplets near the kitchen sink, indicating the perpetrator may have cut themselves during the attack and attempted to wash away the evidence. The forensic team also discovered partial footprints in blood leading toward the back door of the apartment, suggesting the killer had exited through the rear of the building rather than the front entrance, possibly to avoid being seen by neighbors or passers-by on the more heavily trafficked East Gaston Street. Crime scene photographer Sarah Chen captured over 200 images of the scene, including close-ups of what appeared to be defensive wounds on both victims' hands and arms, blood spatter patterns that would later help reconstruct the sequence and direction of the attack, and the disturbed state of the living room suggesting a violent struggle had preceded the killings. The medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Chen, arrived at 10:45 a.m. to conduct his preliminary examination of the bodies before they were transported to the morgue, estimating the time of death to be between 9 p.m. and midnight the previous evening based on body temperature, lividity, and the stage of rigor mortis. His initial observations, noted in the official report, included the fact that both victims were fully clothed with no signs of sexual assault, that the stab wounds appeared to have been inflicted with considerable force, suggesting the attacker was physically strong, and that the pattern of injuries indicated the perpetrator was likely right-handed. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, despite an extensive search of the apartment and surrounding areas, including dumpsters, storm drains, and the dense azalea bushes that lined the property, leading investigators to believe the killer had taken it with them after the attack, a detail that would later prove significant in establishing premeditation rather than a crime of passion. As the bodies were being removed from the scene, Detective Moore interviewed Melissa Jenkins, who explained that she had spent the weekend visiting her parents in Brunswick and had returned earlier than expected Monday morning after her mother came down with the flu. Melissa confirmed that Lisa and Cole regularly spent Sunday evenings together watching movies, a tradition they had maintained for years, and that it wasn't unusual for Cole to stay late, sometimes crashing on their couch if the weather was bad or if they had been drinking. She also provided investigators with a list of Lisa's friends, colleagues, and recent acquaintances, mentioning that Lisa had seemed a bit on edge in recent weeks, but had brushed off concerns when asked about it directly. Melissa specifically recalled Lisa receiving several phone calls in the week before the murders that had left her visibly upset, though Lisa had insisted they were nothing to worry about and had changed the subject when pressed for details. By mid-afternoon, a more extensive canvass of the neighborhood had yielded several potentially important witness statements, including one from Eleanor Brigham, an elderly woman who lived across the street and had been sitting on her porch around 9:30 p.m. when she observed a medium-built white man with light-colored hair hurriedly leaving the area behind Lisa's apartment building. Another neighbor, college student Marcus Dawson, reported hearing what sounded like an argument followed by a woman screaming sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., though he had not called police because such disturbances were not uncommon in the area populated by many college students and young professionals. These witness statements, while providing a general time frame for the murders, did not immediately yield a clear suspect description that could narrow the investigation, as the descriptions were vague, and neither witness had seen the man's face clearly in the dim evening light. The first 48 hours of the investigation saw police conducting over 30 interviews with friends, colleagues, and acquaintances of both victims, generating a substantial list of potential leads, but no obvious suspect with a clear motive for such a violent attack. Cole's mother provided investigators with a list of his closest friends and recent contacts, while Lisa's parents flew in from Atlanta and spent hours helping detectives understand their daughter's social circle and any potential conflicts or concerns she might have mentioned to them. Both sets of parents independently mentioned Dustin Moss as a longtime friend of both victims, describing him as almost like family to Lisa and Cole, having known them both since their teenage years and maintaining regular contact into adulthood. Detective Moore noted in his case file that the parents seemed to view Moss as above suspicion due to the longevity and apparent closeness of his friendship with the victims, an assumption that would later prove to be a tragic miscalculation. Detective Moore and his partner, Detective Sandra Williams, interviewed Dustin Moss on December 20, 1995, at his apartment in the Ardsley Park neighborhood of Savannah, approximately 2 miles from the crime scene. The interview, recorded on audio tape as was standard procedure at the time, captured Moss appearing appropriately distraught, his voice breaking several times as he discussed his long friendship with both victims and his shock at their violent deaths. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of December 17th, Moss claimed he had attended a Christmas party in Charleston, South Carolina, approximately a 2-hour drive from Savannah, stating he had left around 6 p.m. and returned very late that night or early the next morning. He provided the names of 2 acquaintances who could supposedly verify his presence at the party, and detectives made cursory calls to check his alibi, receiving vague confirmations that Moss had been seen at the gathering, though neither witness could specify exact times of his arrival or departure, a discrepancy that was noted but not thoroughly investigated at the time due to the overwhelming number of leads being pursued simultaneously. The forensic evidence collected at the scene was processed at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Crime Lab in Atlanta, with initial results providing some potentially useful information, but no immediate breakthrough in identifying the killer. Blood typing performed on samples found in the apartment confirmed that most of the blood belonged to the victims, but several small droplets near the kitchen sink were of a different type, suggesting the attacker had indeed injured themselves during the commission of the crime. The partial fingerprint found on the doorframe was determined to be smudged and incomplete, making it insufficient for a definitive identification through the fingerprint databases available in 1995, though it was preserved in the evidence files for potential future re-examination. Hair samples found clutched in Lisa's hand were determined to be consistent with Caucasian hair with light brown to blonde coloration, but without attached follicles. DNA testing, still in its relative infancy as a forensic tool, could not be performed effectively, and microscopic comparison was not specific enough to identify an individual suspect. By the end of the first week of the investigation, Detective Moore's case files had expanded to include hundreds of pages of interview transcripts, forensic reports, and investigative notes, yet a clear suspect had not emerged from the mountain of information being gathered. The local media covered the case extensively, with the Savannah Morning News running daily front-page stories about the investigation, and local television stations, featuring updates on their evening broadcasts, keeping public interest and pressure for an arrest at high levels. A reward fund established by the victims' families and supported by community donations quickly grew to $25,000 for information, leading to an arrest and conviction, generating dozens of tips to the police hotline, most of which proved to be dead ends based on rumor or speculation rather than actionable intelligence. Despite the public attention and police resources dedicated to the case, the investigation began to stall as weeks passed without a breakthrough, eventually being classified as a cold case when active leads were exhausted and investigative resources had to be reallocated to new crimes occurring in the city. The DNA evidence that would eventually prove crucial in solving the case was collected during the initial investigation but remained unanalyzed due to technological limitations of the time and the prohibitive cost of the still developing DNA testing procedures. Several small blood samples believed to belong to the perpetrator were carefully preserved in the evidence storage facility, along with the hair samples found in Lisa's hand and swabs taken from various surfaces in the apartment that might contain trace biological material from the killer. The preservation protocols followed by the Savannah Police Department's evidence technicians in 1995, while not as sophisticated as modern methods, were nevertheless sufficient to maintain the integrity of the biological samples for future testing, an inadvertent but crucial step that would eventually lead to justice decades later. Detective Moore, in what would prove to be a prescient decision, specifically noted in his final case report before the investigation was suspended, advances in forensic technology may someday allow for more conclusive analysis of the biological evidence collected in this case, which should be preserved indefinitely. 20 years passed with the Adams Mills murder case lying dormant in the Savannah Police Department's cold case files, a folder that grew thin as leads dried up and witnesses moved away or died. During those 2 decades, advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis, revolutionized how law enforcement approached unsolved violent crimes. In 2015, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received a federal grant specifically earmarked for testing backlogged rape kits and cold case DNA evidence, part of a nationwide effort to leverage new technologies to bring closure to victims and their families. Special Agent Camilla Reeves, assigned to oversee the grant implementation, began by prioritizing cases with preserved biological evidence that had never been subjected to modern DNA analysis, creating a database of potential cases that included the 1995 double homicide of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills. While the Adams Mills case was being prepared for new DNA testing, a seemingly unrelated case from 1990 was also being processed. Through the same grant initiative, a sexual assault that had occurred in Atlanta involving a college student who had reported being attacked by an acquaintance at an off-campus party. The victim had undergone a rape kit examination at Grady Memorial Hospital, but due to a combination of case backlog, limited resources, and the victim eventually deciding not to pursue charges after receiving threatening phone calls, the kit had been placed in storage and never tested. The 25-year-old rape kit was among thousands being processed under the new initiative, with technicians at the GBI Crime Lab extracting DNA from the samples and running it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders and unsolved crime scenes across the country. On March 17, 2016, GBI forensic analyst Dr. Marcus Wong received an automated notification that the DNA profile generated from the 1990 rape kit had matched with a sample from the unsolved 1995 double homicide in Savannah. Dr. Wong immediately contacted Special Agent Reeves, who pulled both case files and began piecing together the connection that had eluded investigators for decades. The rape victim from the 1990 case was identified as a woman named Jennifer Blake, who had been a nursing student at Emory University at the same time as Lisa Adams, though investigators had never previously connected the two cases. Agent Reeves carefully read through Jennifer's initial statement from 1990, in which she named her alleged attacker as a fellow student named Dustin Moss, whom she described as a friend of a friend who had offered to walk her home from the party, but instead forced himself on her in a secluded area near campus. Jennifer Blake had never officially withdrawn her complaint against Moss, but had stopped cooperating with the investigation after receiving multiple threatening phone calls warning her that no one would believe her and that her reputation would be destroyed if she pursued the case. The detective's notes from 1990 indicated that without the victim's cooperation and with no physical evidence analysis completed due to resource constraints, the case against Moss had been effectively abandoned without charges being filed. Agent Reeves, reviewing the case with fresh eyes, immediately recognized the significance of the DNA match linking Moss to both the 1990 assault and the 1995 double homicide, particularly given that Lisa Adams and Dustin Moss had attended the same university during the period of the reported assault, creating a potential motive that had never been explored by the original homicide investigators in Savannah. The next step for Agent Reeves was to locate Dustin Moss and determine if he was still in the Georgia area, a task complicated by the passage of time, but ultimately successful through driver's license records and social media searches. To her surprise, Moss had never left Savannah, having built a successful career as a pharmaceutical sales representative with a territory covering the coastal Georgia region. Married with 2 teenage children, and living in an affluent suburb of the city. His social media profiles painted the picture of a devoted family man active in his church and local youth sports leagues, with nothing to suggest his possible connection to violent crimes committed decades earlier. This jarring contrast between Moss's public persona and his potential criminal past only intensified Agent Reeves's determination to build a solid case before making any move that might alert him to the investigation. While Agent Reeves was tracing Moss's current whereabouts, the GBI lab continued its analysis of the preserved evidence from the Savannah homicide, applying advanced techniques that hadn't existed in 1995. The partial fingerprint that had been deemed insufficient for identification using the technologies available at the time of the original investigation was digitally enhanced and run through AFIS, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, resulting in a possible match to fingerprints Moss had submitted for a security clearance required by the pharmaceutical company employing him. The hair samples found in Lisa Adams's hand, which had only been microscopically examined in the original investigation, now underwent mitochondrial DNA analysis, which, while not as specific as nuclear DNA, indicated consistency with Moss's maternal haplogroup, adding another piece to the mounting scientific evidence against him. With these forensic connections established, Agent Reeves reached out to Detective Lucas Moore, who had since been promoted to captain of detectives but had never forgotten the Adams Mills case, keeping a copy of the file in his desk drawer throughout his career. Moore was skeptical at first, finding it difficult to believe that Dustin Moss, someone who had been interviewed and seemingly cleared in the original investigation, could be responsible for the brutal murders of his longtime friends. His skepticism quickly turned to focused determination as Agent Reeves laid out the DNA evidence linking Moss to both the 1990 assault and the 1995 crime scene, evidence that simply hadn't been available during the original investigation. Captain Moore agreed to assist in reopening the case, bringing his institutional knowledge and personal connection to the investigation while allowing Agent Reeves to lead with her fresh perspective and expertise in modern forensic techniques. The investigative team's next priority was to locate and interview Jennifer Blake, the victim from the 1990 assault case, to understand any potential connections between her attack and the later double homicide. After some difficulty, they found her living in Oregon under a married name, working as a nurse practitioner in a women's health clinic. Initially reluctant to revisit the traumatic events of her past, Jennifer ultimately agreed to speak with investigators via video conference, her hands visibly shaking as she recounted the assault and its aftermath. During the interview, she revealed a critical piece of information that had never been documented in the original case file. After her assault, she had confided in a fellow nursing student about what had happened, seeking support and guidance from someone she trusted, and that student had been Lisa Adams. Jennifer's revelation that Lisa Adams had known about the 1990 assault immediately provided investigators with a potential motive for the 1995 double homicide. Moss may have feared that Lisa would eventually expose him, particularly as the years passed, and he established a respectable life and career in Savannah. Jennifer explained that Lisa had been supportive and encouraged her to pursue charges against Moss, even offering to testify about Jennifer's immediate distress and disclosure, but had respected Jennifer's ultimate decision to step back from the investigation after the threatening calls began. Jennifer broke down during the interview when told of the DNA match to the murders, saying through tears, "I always wondered if my silence had consequences I couldn't see, if someone else got hurt because I was too afraid to speak up." Armed with this new understanding of the potential motive, investigators began re-interviewing friends and colleagues of Lisa Adams who were still available, asking specifically about any signs of tension or unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to her murder. Lisa's former roommate, Melissa Jenkins, now living in Charlotte, North Carolina, recalled more details about Lisa's demeanor in those final weeks, describing her as increasingly anxious, and remembering a specific phone call after which Lisa had seemed particularly disturbed. When pressed for more details, Melissa remembered Lisa saying something about finally doing the right thing and not letting fear win anymore, comments that had seemed cryptic at the time, but now took on new significance in light of the connection to the 1990 assault case. One of Cole Mills's former colleagues from Savannah High School, history teacher Rebecca Sanderson, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle, recalling a conversation with Cole approximately 2 weeks before his death, in which he mentioned being concerned about a friend who was planning to come forward about something serious from the past. According to Rebecca, Cole had expressed both pride in his friend's courage and concern about potential repercussions, saying he had promised to be there every step of the way as moral support. While Cole hadn't specifically named Lisa as the friend in question, the timing and context strongly suggested to investigators that he had been referring to Lisa's apparent decision to finally speak out about what she knew regarding Moss's assault of Jennifer Blake, making Cole not just a random victim, but a deliberate target as a potential supporting witness. By early 2020, the cold case team had assembled a compelling circumstantial case connecting Moss to both crimes, supported by modern DNA analysis that placed him at both scenes with scientific certainty. Captain Moore and Agent Reeves presented their findings to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office, where prosecutor Emily Turner reviewed the evidence and authorized a warrant for Moss's arrest on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The team decided on a careful approach to the arrest, concerned that Moss might flee if he became aware of the renewed investigation, particularly given his financial resources and the potential life sentence he faced if convicted. A surveillance team was established to monitor Moss's movements while final preparations for the arrest were made, including coordinating with his employer to determine when he would be at their Savannah office rather than traveling his sales territory or at home with his family. The significance of the DNA match cannot be overstated in understanding how a suspect finally emerged in this long, cold case. The biological evidence that had sat untested for decades became the key that unlocked the truth. revealing connections that might otherwise have remained buried forever. The specific DNA profile generated from both the 1990 rape kit and the 1995 murder scene was determined to be extraordinarily rare, with statistical analysis placing the probability of a random match at approximately 1 in several trillion, essentially eliminating any reasonable doubt about the source of the DNA samples. This scientific certainty transformed what might have remained circumstantial evidence into an ironclad connection between Dustin Moss and both crime scenes, finally giving investigators the breakthrough they needed to move forward with an arrest after 25 years of silence. With Dustin Moss identified as the prime suspect through DNA evidence, investigators began the painstaking process of constructing a comprehensive case that would stand up in court, knowing that the decades-long gap between the crimes and the arrest would present unique challenges. Agent Reeves established a secure war room at the GBI regional office in Savannah, where walls soon became covered with timelines, photographs, and connection maps, linking various pieces of evidence and witness statements across the decades. The team conducted deep background investigations into Moss's life during the intervening years, discovering several disturbing patterns that had gone unnoticed as he built his outwardly respectable life in the community. These included 3 complaints of inappropriate behavior toward female colleagues at his pharmaceutical company that had been settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements, suggesting his predatory tendencies had continued long after the 1990 assault and 1995 murders. Captain Moore focused on rebuilding the timeline of the December 17, 1995 murders, starting with Lisa and Cole's last confirmed public appearance at a local cafe for lunch that day, through witness statements about their planned movie night, to the estimated time of death between 9 p.m. and midnight. Phone records from the period, which had been preserved in the case file, showed that Lisa had made 3 calls to Dustin Moss in the week before her death, with the final call occurring on Friday, December 15th, lasting nearly 20 minutes. This timing aligned perfectly with Melissa Jenkins's recollection of Lisa appearing particularly upset after a phone conversation that weekend, lending support to the theory that Lisa had informed Moss of her intention to come forward about what she knew regarding the 1990 assault case, potentially triggering his decision to silence both her and Cole permanently. The original alibi Moss had provided during his 1995 interview claimed he was at a Christmas party in Charleston, South Carolina, on the night of the murders, approximately a 2-hour drive from Savannah. With renewed focus, investigators tracked down the host of that long-ago party, Dr. Marshall Cohen, now retired in Florida, who still had a guest book from the event among his memorabilia. Upon examination, Moss's signature did appear in the book, but the team noticed something crucial that had been missed in the original investigation. The party had actually occurred on Saturday, December 16th, not Sunday the 17th, as Moss had claimed. This discovery directly contradicted Moss's alibi for the night of the murders and suggested a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators by conflating the 2 dates, a deception that had successfully diverted suspicion in the original investigation. Jennifer Blake, the victim from the 1990 assault, provided investigators with additional context that strengthened the connection between the 2 cases after overcoming her initial reluctance to become involved. During an extended interview conducted in Portland, where Agent Reeves flew to meet with her in person, Jennifer revealed that she and Lisa had remained in sporadic contact in the years following the assault, primarily through occasional letters and holiday cards. In the last communication she received from Lisa, dated approximately 3 months before the murder, Lisa had mentioned finally finding the courage to address something important from the past, though she hadn't explicitly stated her intentions regarding the assault case. Jennifer also recalled that Moss had been aware of her friendship with Lisa as they had all been part of the same extended social circle at Emory University, making it entirely plausible that Moss would have recognized Lisa as a threat to his reputation and freedom if she decided to support Jennifer in renewing the assault allegations. The forensic evidence, re-examined with modern technology, provided even more concrete connections between Moss and the crime scene. The partial bloody fingerprint found on the door frame, initially deemed insufficient for identification, was now definitively matched to Moss's right index finger using advanced digital enhancement techniques and the more comprehensive fingerprint databases available to investigators in 2020. Blood samples collected from the kitchen sink area of Lisa's apartment, preserved in the evidence storage facility for 25 years, yielded a complete DNA profile matching Moss with scientific certainty, confirming the theory that he had cut himself during the frenzied attack and attempted to wash away the evidence before fleeing. Even the murder weapon, though never recovered, was linked to Moss through credit card records showing he had purchased a hunting knife from a sporting goods store in Savannah 3 days before the murders, an item conspicuously absent from his home when investigators conducted a search following his arrest. As the case against Moss solidified, investigators also explored the psychological aspects of the crimes, consulting with FBI behavioral analysts to understand the progression from the 1990 assault to the 1995 double homicide. The analysts noted that the extreme violence of the murders, with multiple stab wounds far beyond what was necessary to cause death, indicated not just a desire to silence potential witnesses, but a profound rage that suggested personal betrayal and fear of exposure. The fact that Moss had maintained connections to the Savannah community where the murders occurred, even attending the victim's funeral and maintaining relationships with their families, aligned with known patterns of certain psychopathic offenders who derive satisfaction from remaining close to their crimes and manipulating the grief of those around them, all while appearing to be appropriately affected by the tragedy. The motive, fear of exposure for prior abuse, became increasingly clear as investigators pieced together the connections between the 1990 assault and the 1995 murders. By 1995, Moss had established himself in Savannah, beginning his career in pharmaceutical sales and cultivating the image of a respectable young professional. If Lisa had come forward with her knowledge of the assault on Jennifer Blake, potentially encouraging Jennifer to reopen the case, Moss would have faced not only criminal charges, but the destruction of the carefully constructed life and identity he had built. His rage at Lisa for this perceived betrayal, combined with his knowledge that Cole would likely support her as a loyal friend, provided a compelling explanation for why he would risk everything to silence them both permanently, a desperate gamble that had nearly paid off due to the limitations of forensic science at the time. Detective Sandra Williams, who had been part of the original investigation team in 1995 and had since retired, provided valuable insights when brought in as a consultant on the reopened case. She recalled that during Moss's initial interview, he had seemed appropriately distraught, but had exhibited subtle behavioral indicators that had struck her as potentially deceptive, including inconsistent eye contact when discussing his whereabouts on the night of the murders, and excessive unprompted details about the Christmas party he claimed to have attended. While these observations alone had been insufficient to classify him as a suspect at the time, especially given his long-standing friendship with the victims and seeming lack of motive, they took on new significance when viewed through the lens of what investigators now knew about his connection to both crime scenes and his history of violence against women. In building their case, prosecutors also focused on establishing Moss's physical capability to commit the murders, noting that he had been an avid weightlifter and recreational boxer in 1995, giving him the strength and combat skills necessary to overpower both victims, even if they fought back, as the defensive wounds on their bodies indicated they had. Former acquaintances from that period described Moss as having a quick temper that contrasted sharply with his usually charming demeanor, with one former girlfriend from 1994 revealing that she had ended their relationship after he became frighteningly aggressive during an argument, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave bruises. This pattern of controlling behavior and capacity for violence, though never resulting in formal charges, added another layer to the emerging portrait of Dustin Moss as someone capable of escalating to extreme violence when his sense of control was threatened. The investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting premeditation, a crucial element for the first-degree murder charges prosecutors intended to pursue. Beyond the purchase of the hunting knife days before the crime, investigators discovered that Moss had called in sick to work on Monday, December 18, 1995, the day after the murders, despite having no documented illness and being seen by neighbors washing his car thoroughly that same morning. Bank records showed an ATM withdrawal of $500 on December 16th, an unusually large amount for Moss at that time, based on his typical banking patterns, suggesting possible preparation for a period of hiding or flight if the murders had been discovered more quickly or if he had been immediately suspected. These details, insignificant in isolation, formed a compelling pattern of deliberate planning when viewed collectively in the context of what investigators now knew about his motives and actions. By the time the investigation file was presented to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office in February 2020, it contained thousands of pages of evidence, witness statements, and expert analyses spanning 3 decades. Prosecutor Emily Turner, assigned as lead counsel for what would surely be a high-profile case, spent weeks reviewing the materials and consulting with forensic experts to ensure that the scientific evidence would be presented clearly and convincingly to a jury. The DNA evidence formed the backbone of the case, providing scientific certainty of Moss's presence at both crime scenes, while the circumstantial evidence, the contradicted alibi, the documented purchase of a knife matching the likely murder weapon, the established motive of silencing potential witnesses to a prior assault, created a comprehensive narrative explaining not just who had committed these brutal murders, but why. With all elements of the case in place, Turner secured grand jury indictments against Dustin Moss for 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, charges that potentially carried the death penalty in Georgia. On the morning of March 3, 2020, a joint team of GBI agents and Savannah Police Department detectives surrounded the regional offices of MediPharma Inc., where Dustin Moss was scheduled to attend a quarterly sales meeting. The arrest team, led by Agent Reeves and Captain Moore, waited until Moss had entered the building and taken his seat in the conference room before making their move, wanting to avoid both a potential public confrontation and the possibility that Moss might destroy evidence if approached at his home. At precisely 9:17 a.m., as the meeting was beginning, 4 officers entered the conference room while others secured the building's exits, with Agent Reeves approaching Moss directly and announcing, "Dustin Moss, you are under arrest for the murders of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills." The stunned silence that fell over the room was broken only by the metallic click of handcuffs being secured around Moss's wrists, as Captain Moore recited his Miranda rights in a clear, deliberate voice that betrayed none of the emotional satisfaction he felt at finally bringing charges in a case that had haunted him for 25 years. Moss's initial reaction was one of apparent shock and confusion, his face draining of color as he repeatedly asked, "What is this about?" despite Agent Reeves's clear statement of the charges. His colleagues at the pharmaceutical company watched in disbelief as the man they had known as a successful sales representative, devoted family man, and active community volunteer was led away in handcuffs, accused of a brutal double murder committed decades earlier. As he was escorted through the office to a waiting police vehicle, Moss maintained a facade of bewildered innocence, making eye contact with coworkers and saying, "This is crazy. There's been some mistake." in a carefully modulated voice that seemed calculated to project both confidence and indignation. Once placed in the back of the unmarked police car, however, officers noted that Moss became silent and withdrawn, staring straight ahead with an unreadable expression as they drove him to the Chatham County Detention Center for processing before his formal interrogation. Simultaneously with Moss's arrest, separate teams executed search warrants at his suburban Savannah home and the storage unit he maintained at a facility on the city's south side. His wife, Karen Moss, collapsed in tears when officers explained why they were searching the property, repeatedly insisting there must be some mistake, as her husband of 18 years couldn't hurt anyone. The couple's 2 teenage children were at school during the search, sparing them the immediate trauma of witnessing officers combing through their family home for evidence linking their father to a double homicide that had occurred before they were born. The search teams were particularly focused on finding any journals, letters, or other documents from the 1995 period that might contain references to Lisa Adams, Cole Mills, or Jennifer Blake, as well as any photographs or mementos that might indicate a continued psychological connection to the crimes across the decades that had passed since their commission. At 1:30 p.m., after being processed into the detention center and allowed to meet briefly with a public defender who would represent him until private counsel could be arranged, Dustin Moss was brought to an interrogation room where Agent Reeves and Captain Moore waited to question him about the murders. The interrogation, recorded on video that would later be played for the jury, began with standard procedural questions establishing Moss's identity and confirming he understood his rights before transitioning to direct questions about his whereabouts on December 17, 1995. Moss initially maintained the same alibi he had provided in his original interview 25 years earlier, claiming he had been at a Christmas party in Charleston on the night of the murders and had not returned to Savannah until the following morning, his tone confident and unwavering as he recounted details of the gathering and the people he claimed had seen him there. The interrogation strategy shifted dramatically when Agent Reeves placed a folder on the table between them and began laying out photographs from the crime scene, including graphic images of Lisa and Cole's bodies as they had been discovered. Moss visibly recoiled from the photographs, turning his head away and saying, "I don't need to see this, they were my friends." When asked why, if they were such close friends, he had seemed to forget that the Christmas party he cited as his alibi had actually occurred on Saturday, December 16th, not Sunday, December 17th. Moss became flustered, claiming that the passage of time had confused his memories of the exact date. Captain Moore then produced a copy of the guest book from the party, which clearly showed the date as December 16th, 1995, alongside Moss's own signature, creating the first visible crack in his composed facade as he struggled to explain the discrepancy. As the interrogation continued, Agent Reeves methodically introduced the forensic evidence linking Moss to the crime scene, beginning with the least scientifically complex and building toward the DNA evidence that formed the cornerstone of the case. She explained how modern technology had allowed them to enhance and positively identify the partial fingerprint found at the scene as matching Moss's right index finger, showed him photographs of the blood droplets found near the kitchen sink that contained his DNA, and described how hair consistent with his had been found clutched in Lisa Adams's hand, indicating she had grabbed at her attacker during the struggle that preceded her death. With each piece of evidence presented, Moss's demeanor shifted subtly from confident denial toward defensive anger, his responses becoming increasingly clipped and his body language more closed as he repeatedly stated, "That's not possible," and "There's been a mistake with your tests." The most dramatic moment of the interrogation came when Agent Reeves revealed the connection between the 1995 murders and the 1990 sexual assault case involving Jennifer Blake, explaining how DNA from both crime scenes had been matched through the CODIS database. For several seconds, Moss sat in stunned silence, visibly processing this unexpected connection between two events he had likely believed were safely buried in the past, before erupting in a burst of profanity and declaring, "That ain't be mine DNA, someone's setting me up." His sudden shift to non-standard grammar and pronunciation, contrasting sharply with his otherwise articulate speech patterns, struck investigators as a potential indicator of extreme stress breaking through his carefully maintained facade, an observation that would later be noted by the prosecution's behavioral expert during trial testimony. Following this outburst, Moss attempted to regain his composure, requesting water and taking several deep breaths before launching into an elaborate alternative explanation for why his DNA might have been found at both crime scenes. He claimed that he had visited Lisa's apartment earlier on the day of the murders to drop off a Christmas gift, during which he had cut his finger on a kitchen knife while helping her prepare snacks, explaining the blood near the sink. As for his DNA being linked to the 1990 assault case, he suggested that he and Jennifer Blake had engaged in consensual sexual activity at the party before someone else attacked her later that night, insinuating that she had falsely accused him out of confusion or embarrassment about having multiple partners in one evening. Both explanations contained significant logical flaws and contradicted established facts from the investigations, particularly his earlier claims of not being in Savannah at all on the day of the murders, inconsistencies that Agent Reeves calmly pointed out as Moss became increasingly agitated. As the interrogation approached the 3-hour mark, Captain Moore shifted focus to the motive, directly asking Moss if he had killed Lisa and Cole because Lisa knew about the assault on Jennifer Blake and had threatened to support Jennifer in renewing those allegations. Moss's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face flushed red. He pounded his fist on the table, and he shouted, "Lisa would never do that to me. She was my friend." This emotional response to the suggestion of betrayal, rather than to the accusation of murder itself, struck both investigators as telling, particularly when Moss followed it with a rambling statement about how real friends protect each other, and don't go spreading lies that could ruin someone's life. Sentiments that seemed to inadvertently reveal his perspective on Lisa's apparent decision to support Jennifer's allegations against him. Throughout the remainder of the interrogation, Moss cycled between angry denials, attempts to poke holes in the evidence, and increasingly implausible alternative explanations for the scientific findings that placed him at both crime scenes. When confronted with credit card records showing he had purchased a hunting knife matching the likely murder weapon just days before the killings, he claimed the purchase was for a camping trip that had been planned but later canceled, and that he had subsequently lost the knife during a move. When asked why he had called in sick to work the day after the murders and was seen meticulously washing his car that same morning, he offered vague explanations about having a stomach virus and noticing bird droppings on his vehicle, responses that strained credibility even as he delivered them with apparent sincerity. After nearly 5 hours of questioning, with Moss growing increasingly fatigued and his explanations becoming more contradictory, his court-appointed attorney entered the interrogation room and advised him to stop answering questions, effectively ending the session. As he was led back to his holding cell, Moss turned to Captain Moore and said in a quiet voice that contrasted sharply with his earlier outbursts, "I love them both, you know. I would never have hurt them." The statement, captured clearly on the interrogation room's audio recording, struck investigators as particularly chilling given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, perhaps offering a glimpse into the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to live a seemingly normal life in the same community where he had committed such brutal murders, maintaining relationships with the victims' families, and presenting himself as a grieving friend for 25 years. In the days following Moss's arrest, News of the breakthrough in the long, cold case spread rapidly throughout Savannah, generating intense media coverage and reopening emotional wounds for many who had known and loved Lisa and Cole. The victims' families expressed a complex mixture of relief, renewed grief, and shock at the identity of the alleged killer. With Lisa's father, Richard Adams, telling reporters, "To think that we hugged this man at our daughter's funeral, that we accepted his condolences and his support, while all along he was the monster who took her from us. It's beyond comprehension." Cole's mother, now in her 80s and living in an assisted living facility, was reported to have broken down in tears upon hearing that her son's killer had finally been identified, saying simply, "I always prayed I would live long enough to see justice for my boy." Moss's family, meanwhile, faced their own nightmare as their lives were suddenly thrust into a maelstrom of public scrutiny and private doubt. His wife initially stood by him, making a brief statement to the press maintaining her belief in his innocence, but within weeks had filed for divorce and sought a protective order to prevent media from approaching their children who had been pulled from school due to unwanted attention. Friends and colleagues from MediPharma expressed shock and disbelief, many struggling to reconcile the charismatic, successful professional they had known with the brutal killer described in news reports and court documents. The company itself issued a statement expressing sympathy for the victims' families and confirming that Moss had been terminated from his position, while also noting that he had passed all standard background checks before being hired, as the assault allegation from 1990 had never resulted in charges and the double homicide had remained unsolved. The arrest and interrogation of Dustin Moss marked the culmination of 25 years of technological advancement, investigative persistence, and perhaps a measure of cosmic justice that had finally aligned to bring a killer to account for his crimes. As he was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, remanded to custody without bail, and scheduled for arraignment in Chatham County Superior Court, the stage was set for what promised to be one of the most high-profile criminal trials in Savannah's recent history. The cold case team, led by Agent Reeves and Captain Moore, had successfully bridged a quarter-century gap to connect a respected community member to brutal crimes committed in his youth, proving that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, cannot remain hidden forever. When science, determination, and the fundamental human desire for justice align to uncover the truth. The Chatham County Courthouse, a stately neoclassical building in the heart of downtown Savannah, was surrounded by news vans and crowds of onlookers on the morning of October 12, 2021, as Dustin Moss's murder trial finally began after numerous delays caused by both pandemic-related court restrictions and defense motions seeking to suppress the DNA evidence. Judge Eleanor Simmons, a veteran jurist known for running a tight courtroom, had granted limited media access, allowing a single pool camera to capture proceedings while strictly prohibiting photography of the jury, a compromise that balanced the public's right to witness the high-profile case with concerns about outside influence on the judicial process. The victims' families sat in a reserved section of the gallery, Lisa's parents now in their 70s and accompanied by her 2 brothers, while Cole's elderly mother was assisted by his cousins, all of them wearing small blue ribbons that had become a symbol of remembrance for the 2 friends whose lives had been cut short 26 years earlier. Moss entered the courtroom in a navy blue suit that hung somewhat loosely on his frame, having lost significant weight during his 18 months of pre-trial detention, his hair now showing substantial gray that hadn't been present in his arrest photographs. He was represented by prominent defense attorney Harrison Becker, known for handling high-profile cases throughout the Southeast, whose services were presumably being funded by Moss's family despite their public distancing from him following his arrest. The defendant maintained a carefully neutral expression as he was escorted to the defense table, making brief eye contact with his now ex-wife, who sat several rows back, while studiously avoiding looking toward the section where the victims' families were seated. Local observers noted the stark contrast between Moss's current subdued demeanor and the confident, outgoing personality he had displayed during his years as a successful pharmaceutical representative and coach in youth sports leagues. Prosecutor Emily Turner, who had spent more than a year preparing for this moment, strode to the center of the courtroom once the jury of 8 women and 4 men had been seated and sworn in. In her opening statement, delivered in a measured tone that commanded attention without sensationalism, Turner laid out the case against Moss in clear chronological order, beginning with the 1990 sexual assault of Jennifer Blake that had initially gone unpunished due to the victim's fear and the limitations of forensic science at that time. She methodically connected this earlier crime to the 1995 murders, explaining how Lisa Adams had learned of the assault through her friendship with Jennifer and had apparently decided, years later, to support Jennifer in potentially reopening the case, creating a powerful motive for Moss to silence both Lisa and Cole, who would likely have supported his friend's decision to come forward. This case spans decades, but its core is quite simple, Turner told the jury, her voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. Dustin Moss assaulted a young woman in 1990 and escaped justice because his victim was too frightened to pursue charges and because DNA testing was still in its infancy. When Lisa Adams decided in 1995 to support the victim and potentially expose Moss's crime, he made the calculated decision to silence her permanently and to eliminate Cole Mills as a potential supporting witness. Turner then walked the jury through the timeline of the murders, from Moss's purchase of a hunting knife 3 days before the killings to his suspicious behavior the day after, including calling in sick to work and meticulously washing his car. She concluded by previewing the forensic evidence that would be presented, emphasizing that modern science had now definitively placed Moss at both crime scenes through DNA matches that were, in her words, as certain as science can be. Defense attorney Becker's opening statement presented a stark contrast in both style and substance, focusing primarily on what he characterized as the rush to judgment by investigators who had reopened a cold case and desperately needed a suspect to close their books. He acknowledged the tragedy of the murders, but suggested that the passage of time had corrupted evidence, contaminated memories, and created a situation where his client was being unfairly targeted based on circumstantial connections and unreliable scientific testing of degraded samples. Becker particularly emphasized the 25-year gap between the crimes and the arrest, questioning how anyone could fairly defend themselves against allegations from so far in the past, when alibis could no longer be verified and witnesses had died, or could no longer clearly recall events from a quarter-century earlier. Becker then outlined the defense's alternative theory of the case, suggesting that Lisa Adams and Cole Mills may have been targeted by someone connected to their professional lives, perhaps a disturbed patient from the hospital where Lisa worked as a nurse, or a troubled student or parent from Cole's teaching career, with Moss's DNA being present at the scene due to his earlier friendly visit that day, an explanation his client had consistently maintained during police questioning. "The prosecution will show you science, and we respect science," Becker told the jury, "but we will demonstrate that even the most sophisticated DNA analysis is subject to interpretation, contamination, and human error, particularly when applied to evidence that has been stored for decades under less than ideal conditions." This strategy telegraphed the defense's intention to attack the reliability of the forensic evidence rather than attempting to establish Moss's innocence through affirmative proof. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene investigators who had been present at Lisa Adams's apartment on December 18, 1995, establishing the brutal nature of the crime through both verbal descriptions and carefully selected crime scene photographs that Judge Simmons had ruled admissible despite defense objections about their potentially prejudicial impact. Officer James Thornton, now retired, described in vivid detail the blood-spattered living room and the positions of the victims' bodies, his testimony occasionally pausing as he struggled with emotions that remained raw even after 26 years. His body camera footage from that morning was played for the jury, providing a methodical visual record of the crime scene that corroborated his verbal account and allowed jurors to see firsthand the evidence of the violent struggle that had preceded the victims' deaths. Dr. Raymond Chen, the medical examiner who had performed the original autopsies in 1995, testified about the cause and manner of death for both victims using anatomical diagrams rather than the more graphic autopsy photographs to illustrate the multiple stab wounds suffered by Lisa Adams and Cole Mills. His testimony established that both victims had defensive wounds on their hands and arms, indicating they had attempted to fight off their attacker, and that the depth and force of the stab wounds suggested the killer was physically strong and likely right-handed, details consistent with Moss's physical attributes at the time. Dr. Chen also testified about the time of death determination, placing it between 9:00 p.m. and midnight on December 17, 1995, a window that directly contradicted Moss's alibi about being in Charleston during those hours. The prosecution then called Jennifer Blake, now a 51-year-old nurse practitioner who had flown in from Oregon, to testify about the 1990 assault and her subsequent interactions with Lisa Adams. Testimony that Judge Simmons had ruled admissible over strenuous defense objections as evidence of motive, despite the incident having occurred 5 years before the murders. Jennifer's testimony was delivered in a quiet but steady voice, describing how Moss had offered to walk her home from a party near Emory University's campus, but had instead attacked her in a secluded area, ignoring her repeated refusals and using his superior strength to overpower her. She explained that after reporting the assault and undergoing a rape kit examination, she had received threatening phone calls warning her not to pursue charges, causing her to withdraw from the investigation out of fear for her safety and reputation. Jennifer then testified about confiding in Lisa Adams, who had been a fellow nursing student and friend, seeking support and guidance in the aftermath of the assault. Lisa was furious, Jennifer recalled, her voice breaking slightly. She wanted me to go forward with charges, offered to go with me to the police station, to be there through the whole process. But I was too scared, and she respected my decision, even though I could tell she thought I was making a mistake. Jennifer's testimony concluded with her describing a letter she received from Lisa in the fall of 1995, approximately 3 months before the murders, in which Lisa had mentioned finally addressing something important from the past and asking if Jennifer still had documentation of the assault report, a question that took on ominous significance in light of subsequent events. The defense cross-examination of Jennifer Blake was rigorous but carefully modulated, with Becker avoiding any appearance of attacking a sexual assault victim while still attempting to cast doubt on the connection between the 1990 incident and the 1995 murders. He focused particularly on the lack of direct evidence that Lisa had actually contacted Moss about the assault in the days leading up to her death, characterizing the prosecution's motive theory as speculative at best, and suggesting that Jennifer's recollection of a vague letter from months before the murders was being given undue weight in constructing a narrative connecting two separate events. Jennifer remained composed throughout the questioning, acknowledging the points where her memory was uncertain due to the passage of time, but remaining firm in her core testimony about both the assault itself and Lisa's supportive reaction to her disclosure. Captain Lucas Moore, who had been a detective on the original investigation and had participated in the reopened case leading to Moss's arrest, provided extensive testimony about both the initial investigation in 1995 and the breakthrough developments that had occurred in 2016 when the cold case was reactivated. He explained the limitations of forensic science available during the original investigation, acknowledging that DNA testing was still an emerging and expensive technology at that time, and that budget constraints and case backlogs had prevented the biological evidence collected at the scene from being fully analyzed until decades later. Moore's testimony provided crucial context for why Moss had not been identified as a suspect in 1995, despite later evidence revealing his clear connection to the crime scene, explaining that without DNA analysis, investigators had been forced to rely primarily on witness statements and circumstantial evidence, neither of which had pointed strongly toward Moss at that time. Moore also testified about Moss's original interview in 1995, describing how he had provided what appeared at the time to be a plausible alibi about attending a Christmas party in Charleston, an alibi that was only cursorily verified by calling two people Moss had named as potential witnesses. With the benefit of hindsight, Moore admitted under direct examination, "We should have been more thorough in verifying his whereabouts, but at that time, we had no reason to suspect Moss any more than dozens of other acquaintances of the victims, and his long friendship with both Lisa and Cole made him seem an unlikely suspect without a clear motive." This testimony inadvertently provided an opening for the defense, which Becker exploited during cross-examination by suggesting that the original investigation had been rushed and superficial, potentially missing other more viable suspects who were never properly eliminated. The first week of trial concluded with testimony from Melissa Jenkins, Lisa's former roommate who had discovered the bodies, and Rebecca Sanderson, Cole's teaching colleague, who had reported his mention of a friend planning to come forward about something serious from the past shortly before his death. Both witnesses provided context for the victim's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the murders, describing Lisa as increasingly anxious and Cole as concerned but supportive of a friend's difficult decision, while neither witness could definitively state that Lisa had planned to expose Moss's assault on Jennifer Blake, or that Cole's supportive comments definitely referred to Lisa's decision. Their testimony collectively reinforced the prosecution's theory about the motive behind the killings, painting a picture of mounting tension and significant decisions being contemplated just before the murders took place. As the first phase of the trial concluded and the court adjourned for the weekend, legal observers noted that the prosecution had effectively established both the brutality of the crime and a compelling potential motive while laying groundwork for the scientific evidence that would form the core of their case in the coming week. The defense, meanwhile, had consistently worked to create doubt about the reliability of decades-old evidence and memories, while suggesting that the investigation had prematurely focused on Moss to the exclusion of other potential suspects. With the DNA evidence still to be presented, the most scientifically complex and potentially definitive aspect of the case remained ahead, setting the stage for expert testimony that would either solidify the prosecution's narrative or provide the defense with opportunities to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors still absorbing the emotional impact of testimony about two young lives violently ended 26 years earlier. The second week of the trial began with the prosecution presenting its cornerstone scientific evidence, calling Dr. Marcus Wong, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst who had made the critical DNA match between the 1990 rape kit and the 1995 murder scene. Dr. Wong, who held a Ph.D. in molecular biology and had worked in forensic DNA analysis for over 15 years, approached the witness stand with a confident demeanor of someone accustomed to explaining complex scientific concepts to lay audiences. Using a series of simplified visual aids that had been pre-approved by the court, he methodically walked the jury through the basics of DNA analysis, the advances in technology that had occurred between 1995 and 2016, and the specific techniques used to extract and analyze the genetic material recovered from both crime scenes. His testimony was carefully structured to be educational rather than technical, breaking down the science into digestible concepts while still conveying the reliability and significance of the DNA evidence connecting Dustin Moss to both the assault and the murders. Dr. Wong explained that blood samples collected from near the kitchen sink in Lisa Adams's apartment had yielded a complete DNA profile that matched Dustin Moss with a random match probability of approximately 1 in several trillion, effectively eliminating any reasonable possibility that the blood had come from someone else. To put this in perspective, Dr. Wong told the jury, the current world population is less than 8 billion people, so the probability of this DNA belonging to someone other than the defendant is significantly less likely than finding a specific grain of sand on all the beaches of the world. He further testified about the hair samples found clutched in Lisa Adams's hand, explaining that while mitochondrial DNA analysis was less specific than nuclear DNA testing, the results were consistent with Moss's maternal haplogroup, providing additional corroborative evidence of his presence during the struggle that preceded her death. The most dramatic moment of Dr. Wong's testimony came when he described the CODIS database hit that had initially broken the case open, explaining how the DNA profile generated from the previously untested 1990 rape kit had matched with the profile from the 1995 murder scene, linking the two crimes through scientific evidence that hadn't been available to investigators in either the original sexual assault case or the initial murder investigation. This match was not a close call or a partial match, Dr. Wong emphasized. It was a complete match across all genetic markers tested, as definitive as DNA matching can be. This testimony established the scientific foundation for the prosecution's narrative, connecting the two crimes through both motive and physical evidence, potentially explaining why a seemingly respected community member with no other criminal history would commit such a brutal double homicide. During cross-examination, defense attorney Becker mounted a vigorous challenge to the DNA evidence, focusing not on the science itself, but on the handling and storage of the biological samples over the 25 years between collection and analysis. He questioned Dr. Wong extensively about potential degradation of samples, possible contamination during storage, and chain of custody issues that might have arisen during the decades the evidence sat in storage facilities that did not have the sophisticated preservation protocols used in modern forensic laboratories. Dr. Wong acknowledged that the storage conditions had not been optimal by current standards, but maintained that the samples had been sufficiently preserved to yield reliable results, emphasizing that DNA is remarkably stable and that the clear, complete profiles obtained indicated minimal degradation had occurred despite the passage of time. Becker then pivoted to his client's alternative explanation for why his DNA might have been found at the crime scene, asking, "Dr. Wong, if Mr. Moss had visited Ms. Adams's apartment earlier on the day of the murders and cut his finger while helping in the kitchen, would that explain the presence of his DNA near the sink?" Dr. Wong conceded that such a scenario could potentially account for the presence of blood, but noted that it would not explain other evidence, such as the hair found in Lisa's hand or the partial fingerprint in blood on the doorframe, which suggested active involvement in the struggle rather than an innocent earlier visit. This exchange highlighted the defense strategy of acknowledging the scientific evidence while offering alternative interpretations that might create reasonable doubt about Moss's direct involvement in the killings. Following Dr. Wong's testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Alessandra Moretti, a leading expert in forensic psychology specializing in the behavioral patterns of perpetrators who maintain long-term deception after violent crimes. Dr. Moretti testified about the psychological mechanisms that allow certain offenders to compartmentalize their criminal acts, enabling them to return to apparently normal lives and even maintain relationships with their victims' families and communities. What we see in cases like this, she explained, is not necessarily the stereotypical sociopath who feels nothing, but rather individuals with highly developed compartmentalization skills who can effectively separate their criminal actions from their day-to-day persona, sometimes to the point of genuinely believing in their own innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Dr. Moretti analyzed Moss's behavior in the aftermath of the murders, attending the victim's funeral, maintaining relationships with their families, even serving as a pallbearer for Cole Mills, characterizing these actions not as anomalies, but as consistent with known patterns among certain types of offenders who derive psychological satisfaction from remaining close to the impact of their crimes while publicly presenting as appropriately grieved. She further testified about the significance of Moss's outburst during interrogation when confronted with the connection between the 1990 assault and the 1995 murders, noting that his declaration, "That ain't be mine DNA," represented a moment of linguistic regression under extreme stress, a phenomenon observed when individuals maintaining long-term deception suddenly face incontrovertible evidence of their guilt. The defense vigorously objected to portions of Dr. Moretti's testimony as speculative and prejudicial, with Judge Simmons sustaining some objections while allowing the core behavioral analysis as relevant to understanding the case's unusual aspects. During cross-examination, Becker challenged Dr. Moretti's analysis, suggesting she was retrofitting general psychological theories to create a narrative about Moss specifically, without having ever personally evaluated him or having any direct knowledge of his actual thought processes during the relevant time periods. Dr. Moretti acknowledged these limitations, but stood by her professional assessment that Moss's behavior fit established patterns seen in similar cases, particularly emphasizing that his maintained friendship with the victims' families was not, as the defense suggested, evidence of innocence, but potentially indicated a more complex psychological relationship to his crimes. The prosecution then called Eleanor Brigham, now 92 years old, and testifying via video link from her nursing home due to her advanced age and health concerns. Despite some initial confusion about dates, Mrs. Brigham clearly recalled seeing a man matching Moss's description hurriedly leaving the area behind Lisa Adams's apartment building on the night of the murders, describing him as moving like he had somewhere important to be, not running exactly, but walking fast and looking around a lot. When shown a photo array that included Moss's image from 1995, she identified him as resembling the man she had seen, though she cautioned that it had been dark and she couldn't be 100% certain. This testimony, while not definitively placing Moss at the scene, provided circumstantial corroboration for his presence in the vicinity at the relevant time, directly contradicting his alibi about being in Charleston that night. Following Mrs. Brigham's testimony, the prosecution played the video recording of Moss's interrogation following his arrest in 2020, which had been ruled admissible by Judge Simmons over defense objections. The jury watched intently as Moss initially maintained his composure while repeating his long-standing alibi about attending a Christmas party in Charleston on the night of the murders, then became increasingly agitated as investigators methodically presented the forensic evidence connecting him to both crime scenes. His explosive reaction to learning that his DNA had been matched to both the 1990 rape kit and the 1995 murder scene, pounding the table and shouting, "That ain't be mine DNA, someone set me up," visibly impacted several jurors, with one older woman shaking her head slightly as she took notes. The video also captured Moss's elaborate alternative explanations for the evidence and his telling response to questions about Lisa potentially exposing his assault on Jennifer Blake, providing jurors with an unfiltered look at his behavior when directly confronted with evidence of his crimes. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Dr. Hakim Rashad, a fingerprint analyst who had used advanced digital enhancement techniques to identify the partial bloody fingerprint found on the door frame between Lisa Adams's living room and hallway as matching Moss's right index finger. Dr. Rashad explained how modern technology had allowed for the extraction of significantly more detail from the original fingerprint photographs than had been possible in 1995, enabling a definitive identification where earlier analysis had been inconclusive. Using side-by-side comparisons projected on a large screen, he identified 12 distinct points of comparison between Moss's known fingerprints and the partial print from the crime scene, well above the threshold typically required for a positive identification in court. This testimony directly refuted Moss's claim about merely visiting the apartment earlier in the day, as the fingerprint was in blood that matched the victim's, indicating it was left during or immediately after the murders. The prosecution then called Marshall Cohen, the host of the Christmas party in Charleston that Moss had claimed to be attending on the night of the murders. Cohen, now 75, and retired in Florida, testified about preserving the guest book from the party as a memento and confirmed that it clearly showed the date as Saturday, December 16, 1995, not Sunday the 17th, as Moss had claimed in his alibi. Cohen further testified that while Moss had indeed attended the Saturday party and signed the guest book, he had no recollection of seeing Moss the following evening and had no record of hosting any event on Sunday, December 17th. This testimony definitively shattered Moss's alibi, establishing that he had deliberately misled investigators by conflating two dates to create a false impression of his whereabouts when the murders occurred, a deception that strongly suggested consciousness of guilt. The defense began presenting its case midway through the second week, calling several character witnesses who had known Moss during the decades between the murders and his arrest, including fellow sales representatives, youth sports parents whose children he had coached, and members of his church congregation. These witnesses uniformly described Moss as responsible, kind, and community-oriented, expressing shock at the charges against him and affirming their belief in his good character based on their personal interactions with him. While effective in establishing Moss's positive reputation in the years following the murders, this testimony also inadvertently reinforced Dr. Moretti's earlier points about compartmentalization, potentially demonstrating how effectively Moss had separated his violent past from his later public persona, rather than proving his innocence of the charges. The defense then called its own DNA expert, Dr. Jonathan Keller, who did not directly challenge the matches identified by Dr. Wong, but instead focused on questioning the reliability of samples stored under less than optimal conditions for over 2 decades before analysis. Dr. Keller suggested that contamination during storage could potentially have affected the results, particularly emphasizing the possibility that Moss's DNA might have been transferred to evidence items through innocent contact during his acknowledged friendship with the victims prior to their deaths. However, under cross-examination by Prosecutor Turner, Dr. Keller was forced to concede several critical points: that the clarity of the DNA profiles obtained argued against significant degradation or contamination, that the blood near the sink was definitively blood rather than another type of biological material that might be explained by casual contact, and that transfer of sufficient DNA to create a complete profile through incidental contact was highly unlikely given the quantity of material recovered from the evidence samples. The final significant defense witness was Dr. Sophia Reynolds, a specialist in memory and eyewitness testimony, who testified about the malleability of human memory and the potential for both unintentional distortion and suggestion-induced false recollections over extended periods of time. Dr. Reynolds explained that memories are not static recordings, but dynamic reconstructions that can change substantially over decades, particularly when influenced by media coverage, conversations with others, or the natural human tendency to create coherent narratives from fragmented recollections. This testimony was clearly intended to cast doubt on the reliability of witness statements from 25 years after the events in question, particularly those suggesting Lisa had been anxious in the weeks before her death, or that Cole had mentioned a friend planning to come forward about something from the past. Throughout the second week of trial, Dustin Moss sat at the defense table, maintaining a carefully neutral expression, occasionally writing notes to his attorney, but showing little visible reaction to even the most damning testimony. His ex-wife attended inconsistently, sometimes present for character witness testimony, but notably absent during the presentation of forensic evidence directly linking him to the crimes. The victims' families remained a constant presence in the courtroom, their expressions reflecting the emotional toll of reliving the trauma, while simultaneously witnessing the systematic dismantling of the carefully constructed life of the man now accused of destroying theirs. As testimony concluded and both sides prepared for closing arguments, legal observers noted that while the defense had raised some theoretical questions about evidence handling and memory reliability, they had failed to significantly undermine the core scientific evidence connecting Moss to both crime scenes or to provide a convincing alternative explanation for why his DNA and fingerprints were found in locations indicating active participation in the murders. On the morning of October 28, 2021, the courtroom was filled to capacity for closing arguments, with additional spectators gathered in an overflow room where proceedings were streamed on a large screen. Prosecutor Emily Turner approached the jury box with measured steps, her demeanor serious but confident as she began her final address summarizing the evidence presented over the previous 2 weeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this case spans decades, but it tells a simple, tragic story about fear, betrayal, and the terrible lengths to which one man went to protect his reputation and freedom." For the next 90 minutes, Turner methodically reviewed the scientific evidence linking Moss to both the 1990 assault and the 1995 murders, the contradiction of his long-maintained alibi by both the Christmas party guest book and witness sightings near the crime scene, and the compelling motive stemming from Lisa Adams's apparent decision to support Jennifer Blake in potentially reviving the assault allegations against Moss. Turner particularly emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, pointing to Moss's purchase of a hunting knife days before the murders, his deliberate fabrication of an alibi that confused the dates of the Christmas party, and his calculated post-murder behavior that included calling in sick to work and meticulously washing his car. "These are not the actions of an innocent man," she told the jury, "but the methodical efforts of someone trying to cover his tracks and distance himself from a brutal crime he had just committed." She concluded by addressing the defense's alternative theories directly, systematically dismantling each one by referencing specific testimony and evidence that contradicted them, ending with a powerful appeal to the jury to finally bring justice to Lisa Adams and Cole Mills, whose lives were cut short because they valued truth and loyalty over protecting a predator. Defense attorney Harrison Becker began his closing argument by acknowledging the tragedy of the murders and expressing sympathy for the victims' families, a rhetorical move designed to establish empathy before transitioning to his core argument that the case against Moss was built on unreliable evidence and speculative connections. 25 years is a very long time, he told the jury, his voice resonant with practiced gravity. Evidence degrades, memories fade and transform, assumptions calcify into perceived facts, and in cold cases like this one, there is an institutional pressure to find someone, anyone, who can be held responsible to provide closure regardless of whether justice is actually being served. This framing attempted to position Moss not as a calculated killer, but as a convenient scapegoat for an investigation that had failed to identify the real perpetrator when the trail was still fresh. Becker focused heavily on creating doubt about the reliability of the DNA evidence, not by challenging the science itself, but by questioning the handling and storage of biological samples over the decades between collection and analysis. He reminded jurors of Dr. Keller's testimony about potential contamination and suggested that even if Moss's DNA was indeed present at the crime scene, the prosecution had failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that it was deposited during the commission of the murders rather than during an earlier, innocent visit, as Moss had consistently maintained. This line of argument strategically sidestepped the most damning aspects of the DNA evidence: the match between two separate crime scenes and the location of the bloody fingerprint in a position inconsistent with casual contact, focusing instead on more abstract concerns about evidence handling protocols that had evolved significantly since 1995. The defense closing also attacked the prosecution's proposed motive, characterizing it as a narrative constructed entirely of speculation and conjecture that failed to establish direct evidence that Lisa Adams had actually threatened to expose Moss's alleged assault on Jennifer Blake in the days leading up to the murders. Becker pointed to the lack of phone records showing conversations between Lisa and Jennifer immediately preceding the killings and the absence of any written documentation of Lisa's intentions, suggesting that the prosecution had built its motive theory on vague recollections of decades-old conversations that could easily have been misremembered or misinterpreted. This approach attempted to create doubt about why Moss, who had maintained close friendships with both victims for years after the alleged assault, would suddenly feel threatened enough to commit such a violent crime against people he supposedly cared about. Throughout his closing, Becker returned repeatedly to the theme of reasonable doubt, reminding jurors that they were not required to determine what had actually happened or who had actually committed the murders, but merely to decide whether the prosecution had proven Moss's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. If you find yourself thinking maybe or probably when considering the evidence, he told them, that is the very definition of reasonable doubt, and your duty under the law would be to return a verdict of not guilty, regardless of your personal suspicions or the emotional weight of this tragic case. This framing attempted to give permission to jurors who might have lingering questions about certain aspects of the case to vote for acquittal, despite the substantial evidence pointing toward Moss's guilt. In her rebuttal, Prosecutor Turner directly addressed the defense's attempts to create doubt about the reliability of the forensic evidence, reminding jurors that despite theoretical concerns raised by the defense expert, the actual DNA profiles obtained were clear, complete, and definitive in their match to Moss. The defense wants you to believe that maybe, somehow, through some unspecified mechanism, this evidence might not be reliable, she said. But what they haven't done, what they cannot do, is explain why Dustin Moss's blood was found near the kitchen sink, why his fingerprint was found in the victim's blood on the doorframe, why his DNA matches both the murder scene and a 5-year earlier sexual assault, or why he lied about his whereabouts on the night Lisa and Cole were killed. This methodical dismantling of the defense's abstract doubts with specific, concrete evidence provided a powerful conclusion to the prosecution's case. After receiving detailed instructions from Judge Simmons about the legal standards they were to apply, the jury began deliberations at 2:45 p.m. The families of both victims remained in the courthouse, gathered in a private room provided by the district attorney's office, while Moss was returned to custody at the detention center to await the verdict. Local media maintained a constant presence outside the courthouse, with reporters providing regular updates on a case that had captured public attention not just in Savannah, but throughout Georgia and beyond, particularly due to the remarkable cold case breakthrough and the shocking revelation that the killer had maintained relationships with the victims' families for decades while living an outwardly respectable life in the same community. At 5:30 p.m., after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict, a surprisingly quick decision in a case of this complexity and magnitude. As word spread through the courthouse, spectators and media representatives rushed back to the courtroom, creating a tense atmosphere of anticipation as the parties reassembled for the announcement. The victims' families entered together, holding hands for support, their faces showing the strain of the long journey to this moment of potential closure. Moss was brought back from the detention center, his expression unreadable as he took his place at the defense table, straightening his tie in what appeared to be a habitual gesture rather than genuine concern for his appearance at this critical moment. Judge Simmons called the court to order and instructed the gallery to maintain complete silence regardless of the verdict, emphasizing that any outbursts would result in immediate removal from the courtroom. The jury filed in silently, several members glancing briefly at Moss before taking their seats, their faces giving no indication of their decision. The foreperson, a retired high school principal in her 60s, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Simmons. After reviewing the document, the judge returned it to the bailiff, who passed it back to the foreperson with instructions to read the verdict aloud, a moment of procedural formality that seemed to stretch endlessly for those awaiting the decision that would determine Dustin Moss's fate. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Lisa Adams, we find the defendant, Dustin Moss, guilty, the foreperson announced in a clear, steady voice that filled the silent courtroom. Before the impact of those words could fully register, she continued, "On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Cole Mills, we find the defendant, Dustin Moss, guilty." A barely audible collective exhalation came from the victims' families, several members closing their eyes briefly as tears began to flow, the emotional release of tension built up not just over the weeks of trial, but over the 26 years since their loved ones had been taken from them. Moss himself showed little visible reaction beyond a slight stiffening of his posture and a tightening of his jaw, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance rather than meeting the gaze of either the jury or the victims' families. Judge Simmons thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would be scheduled for November 15, 2021, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and pre-sentencing reports. As Moss was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Lisa's father, Richard Adams, made brief eye contact with the man now officially convicted of murdering his daughter, a momentary connection charged with decades of grief, anger, and the complicated emotions of having unknowingly maintained a relationship with his daughter's killer for years after her death. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney James Wilson held a press conference thanking the investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors whose work had finally brought justice in this long, cold case, particularly praising Captain Lucas Moore and Agent Camilla Reeves for their persistence in pursuing new leads and applying modern technology to evidence that had been preserved for a quarter-century. The victims' families declined to speak publicly immediately following the verdict, but released a joint statement through their attorney expressing gratitude for the jury's decision and the closure it provided after decades of uncertainty. While nothing can bring back Lisa and Cole or erase the pain of losing them so senselessly, today's verdict affirms what we have always believed, that the truth would eventually come to light and justice would be served no matter how long it took, the statement read. We are grateful to all who never gave up on finding answers, particularly the dedicated law enforcement officers and prosecutors who reopened this case and followed the evidence wherever it led, regardless of how shocking and painful that truth proved to be. In the days following the verdict, Local and national media published in-depth analyses of the case, exploring how advances in forensic science had finally solved a crime that had haunted Savannah for more than 2 decades and examining the psychological aspects of how Moss had maintained his deception for so many years. Crime reconstruction experts noted the particular significance of the DNA connection between the 1990 assault and the 1995 murders, highlighting how the nationwide initiative to process backlogged rape kits had inadvertently provided the key to solving a seemingly unrelated double homicide, potentially offering a model for cold case investigators to look for similar connections in other unsolved crimes from eras when DNA testing was not routinely performed. Moss's ex-wife, Karen, broke her silence in a brief statement released through her attorney, expressing shock and sorrow at the jury's verdict while acknowledging the overwhelming evidence presented at trial. My heart breaks for the families of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills, who have endured unimaginable pain that was compounded by years of uncertainty about who had taken their loved ones from them, she wrote. I am still struggling to reconcile the man I married and raised children with for 18 years with the person capable of such horrific acts, and I ask for privacy as our family attempts to process this devastating reality and find a path forward. The statement reflected the complex secondary trauma experienced by those who had unwittingly built lives with someone harboring such dark secrets. Innocent bystanders whose own sense of reality had been profoundly shaken by revelations about a past they never suspected. Jennifer Blake, whose 1990 assault had been the catalyst for the chain of events leading to the murders, spoke publicly for the first time in an interview with a national news magazine, describing the guilt she had carried for years, wondering if her decision not to pursue charges against Moss had inadvertently contributed to Lisa and Cole's deaths. I've lived with this question haunting me. If I had been braver, if I had pushed forward despite the threats, would Lisa and Cole still be alive? She said, her voice steady despite the evident emotional weight of her words. I can't change the past, but seeing justice finally served has helped me begin to forgive myself for a choice I made when I was young and frightened and didn't fully understand the potential consequences. Her powerful testimony about the ripple effects of sexual assault and the complicated dynamics of victim silence resonated widely, prompting discussions about the barriers that continued to prevent many victims from reporting such crimes and seeking justice. As the sentencing date approached, the Savannah community continued to process the shocking revelation that a respected member of their community had committed such brutal crimes and successfully concealed his guilt for decades while living among them. Local religious leaders organized a memorial service for Lisa and Cole at Forsyth Park, near where a candlelight vigil had been held immediately after their deaths in 1995, providing an opportunity for collective healing and reflection on lives cut short by violence and the long, winding path that had finally led to justice. The service was attended by hundreds, including former patients of Lisa's, from her work as a pediatric nurse, and former students of Cole's who had gone on to become teachers themselves, inspired by his example, living testaments to the positive impact both victims had made during their brief time in the world, impacts that continued to ripple outward long after they were gone. On the morning of November 15, 2021, Dustin Moss entered Courtroom 3A of the Chatham County Courthouse for the last time, dressed in the same navy blue suit he had worn throughout the trial, but now accessorized with handcuffs and ankle restraints that clinked softly as he shuffled to the defense table. At 52 years old, he appeared to have aged a decade in the month since his conviction, his face gaunt, and his shoulders hunched as if physically bearing the weight of his exposed crimes and the punishment he now faced. The sentencing hearing began with Judge Eleanor Simmons explaining the process, noting that both victim impact statements and a pre-sentence investigation report would be considered before she determined Moss's sentence for the 2 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying a potential penalty range from life imprisonment to death under Georgia law. Though the prosecution had previously announced they would not seek the death penalty due to the age of the case and evidentiary considerations. The first victim impact statement came from Richard Adams, Lisa's father, who walked slowly to the podium with the assistance of a cane, the physical embodiment of a man who had aged through decades of grief, while the person responsible for his pain sat free among the community. My daughter was a healer, someone who dedicated her life to caring for sick children and bringing comfort to frightened parents, he began, his voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. The world lost not just the good she did each day as a nurse, but all the good she would have done in the years stolen from her, the children she might have had, the patients she would have healed, the joy and kindness she brought to everyone fortunate enough to know her. Richard then addressed Moss directly, looking at him for the first time since the trial began, his voice hardening with controlled anger as he spoke about the betrayal that had compounded his family's grief. For 25 years, we accepted your condolences, included you in our memories of Lisa, even embraced you as someone who shared our loss, Richard continued, his words landing like physical blows as Moss stared fixedly at the table before him. You stood at her grave while we buried her, knowing your hands had taken her life. You sat at our holiday table in the years that followed, accepting our hospitality while carrying the secret that you had murdered our daughter. There is no punishment adequate for that level of deception, for the violation of not just Lisa's life, but of our trust and our memories. Richard concluded by stating that while he had initially favored pursuing the death penalty, he had come to believe that a life sentence, forcing Moss to live decades in confinement contemplating his crimes, was perhaps the more fitting punishment for someone who had stolen so much life from others. Eleanor Mills, Cole's 84-year-old mother, was too frail to stand at the podium, instead delivering her impact statement from her wheelchair positioned directly in front of the defense table, ensuring Moss could not avoid seeing her as she spoke about the son he had taken from her. Cole was my only child, born after doctors told me I could never have children, my miracle, and my heart, she said, her voice remarkably strong despite her physical fragility. When his father died, Cole became the man of our family at just 16, taking on responsibilities far beyond his years without complaint, always putting others before himself. She described how Cole had chosen teaching as a profession specifically to make a difference in young lives, particularly focusing on students from disadvantaged backgrounds who reminded him of classmates he had grown up with in Richmond Hill. What haunts me most, Eleanor continued, tears now flowing freely down her weathered face, is knowing that Cole died because of his loyalty and goodness, because he was standing by his friend Lisa as she tried to do the right thing. That was who my son was, someone who would never abandon a friend in need, even when it meant facing difficulty or danger. She then addressed the court more broadly, explaining that at her age, she had long since abandoned hope of understanding why someone would commit such a senseless act of violence, seeking instead only the assurance that Moss would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. I will likely not live to see him serve much of his sentence, she concluded with dignified resignation, but I can leave this earth knowing that justice, however delayed, was finally served for my son. Jennifer Blake then approached the podium, her presence in the courtroom a powerful reminder of how the 1990 assault had set in motion the chain of events culminating in the 1995 murders. Though not technically a victim in the case before the court, Judge Simmons had granted special permission for her to speak, given the unique circumstances connecting her assault to the murders. I stand here representing not just myself, but in some sense speaking for Lisa, who became a secondary victim of my assault when she chose to support me and potentially help me seek justice, Jennifer began, her voice steady and clear. The ripple effects of sexual violence extend far beyond the initial crime, touching the lives of friends, family, and community in ways we cannot always anticipate or prevent. Jennifer spoke candidly about the guilt she had carried for years, wondering if her decision not to pursue charges against Moss after the assault had inadvertently contributed to Lisa and Cole's deaths. I made the choice I thought would protect me, never imagining it could endanger someone else, she said, emotion finally cracking through her composed exterior. While I've come to understand that the responsibility for these murders lies solely with the man who committed them, not with me or any other victim who was silenced by fear, I will always wonder what might have been different if I had found the courage Lisa later found, the courage that ultimately cost her life. She concluded by addressing Moss directly, stating that his greatest punishment was not the sentence he would receive, but the knowledge that his attempt to silence the truth had ultimately failed, that the very thing you killed to conceal has been exposed to the world, your crimes laid bare not just for this court, but for history. Following the victim impact statements, Moss was offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, an invitation that prompted murmurs of anticipation throughout the packed gallery. After a brief consultation with his attorney, Moss rose slowly to his feet, adjusting his glasses with shackled hands before speaking in a voice that started softly but gained strength as he continued. I maintain my innocence despite the jury's verdict, he began, prompting visible reactions of disgust from the victims' families. But I do want to express my condolences to the families of Lisa and Cole, who were indeed my friends for many years. Their deaths were a tragedy that affected me deeply as well, and regardless of what this court has decided about my involvement, I mourn them sincerely. This statement, with its careful avoidance of any admission of guilt or expression of remorse while attempting to position Moss as a fellow mourner rather than the perpetrator, seemed to crystallize the profound disconnect between the mountain of evidence presented at trial and Moss's continued insistence on his innocence. Judge Simmons watched impassively as Moss spoke, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts, until he had retaken his seat and she prepared to announce her decision, her decades of judicial experience evident in her measured, deliberate demeanor even at this emotionally charged moment. Mr. Moss, you stand before this court, having been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills, Judge Simmons began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. I have considered the jury's verdict, the pre-sentence investigation report, the victim impact statements presented today, and your own statement to the court. I have also considered the particularly heinous nature of these crimes, involving multiple victims, extensive premeditation, and extreme violence. She paused briefly, her gaze fixed firmly on Moss as she continued. Most disturbing to this court is not just the brutality of the murders themselves, but your calculated deception in the decades that followed, attending the victim's funeral, maintaining relationships with their grieving families, and building a life of apparent respectability while secretly being responsible for their suffering. Judge Simmons then addressed the victims' families directly, acknowledging that no sentence she could impose would adequately address their loss or the unique betrayal they had experienced in unwittingly maintaining a relationship with their loved one's killer. She spoke about the importance of finality in the judicial process, of providing whatever measure of closure was possible after so many years of uncertainty and false connection. Returning her attention to Moss, she delivered her sentence. For the murder of Lisa Adams, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Cole Mills, this court sentences you to a consecutive term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. These sentences are to be served consecutively, rather than concurrently, reflecting the distinct and grievous harm done to each victim. The practical effect of the consecutive life sentences was largely symbolic, as a single life sentence without parole would have been sufficient to ensure Moss remained imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. However, the judge's decision to impose separate, consecutive sentences for each victim sent a clear message about the individual worth of each life taken and ensured that even if future legal developments affected one conviction, the other would remain in force. Judge Simmons concluded the proceedings by thanking the jury for their service, acknowledging the dedicated work of both the prosecution and defense teams, and expressing hope that the resolution of this long, cold case might provide some measure of peace to those whose lives had been shattered by these crimes more than a quarter century earlier. As Moss was led from the courtroom for the final time, his expression remained unreadable, offering no glimpse into whether the weight of his crimes and punishment had penetrated the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to live a double life for so many years. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney James Wilson held a brief press conference characterizing the case as a testament to the power of persistence, scientific advancement, and the fundamental principle that justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail. He specifically praised the nationwide initiative to process backlogged rape kits, noting that without that program, the DNA connection between the 1990 assault and the 1995 murders might never have been discovered, potentially leaving the case unsolved indefinitely. In the months following the sentencing, the ripple effects of the case extended throughout the criminal justice system, with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation receiving additional funding specifically earmarked for cold case investigations utilizing advanced DNA analysis. The Adams Mills case became a frequently cited example of how preserved biological evidence, even decades old, could provide the key to solving seemingly impenetrable cold cases when new technologies and database connections were applied. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing unsolved violent crimes with preserved biological evidence, particularly seeking potential connections between sexual assaults and homicides that might not have been apparent during the original investigations, leading to several additional cold case breakthroughs in other jurisdictions inspired directly by the methodology that had finally solved the Adams Mills murders. The families of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills established the Adams Mills Justice Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting cold case investigations, advocating for the processing of backlogged forensic evidence, and providing resources for families navigating the emotionally complex landscape of long unsolved violent crimes. The Foundation's first initiative, funded partly through donations that poured in following national media coverage of the case, established a grant program to help smaller law enforcement agencies access advanced DNA testing for cold cases that would otherwise remain dormant due to budget constraints. Richard Adams, despite his advanced age, became a powerful public speaker on behalf of the Foundation, turning his decades of grief and newly found closure into action that might help other families still waiting for answers. Jennifer Blake, whose 1990 assault had been the starting point for the chain of events leading to the murders, channeled her experience into advocacy work supporting sexual assault survivors, particularly focusing on the complex factors that prevent many victims from reporting crimes or pursuing charges. She developed an educational program for healthcare providers, law enforcement officers, and prosecutors about trauma-informed approaches to sexual assault cases, emphasizing how proper handling of forensic evidence and sensitive treatment of victims from the outset can make the critical difference in whether cases move forward. Jennifer's perspective, as someone whose assault had indirect but devastating consequences beyond her own experience, offered a unique and powerful voice in conversations about the far-reaching impacts of sexual violence and the importance of creating systems where victims feel safe coming forward immediately, rather than carrying the burden of silence. Dustin Moss was transferred to Georgia State Prison to begin serving his consecutive life sentences, his arrival at the maximum security facility generating brief media attention before public focus shifted to the broader implications of the case rather than the perpetrator himself. Several journalists attempted to secure interviews with Moss, seeking insights into how he had maintained his deception for so many years and whether he would ever acknowledge his guilt. But he declined all requests, retreating into the anonymity of the prison population. His ex-wife and children eventually relocated to another state, changing their surname and attempting to rebuild lives not defined by their connection to a man whose hidden violence had shattered so many lives, including, ultimately, their own. The scientific advancements that had finally solved the case continued to evolve, with forensic DNA analysis becoming increasingly sophisticated in the years following Moss's conviction. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation laboratory that had processed the critical DNA evidence connecting the two crime scenes expanded its capabilities to include genetic genealogy techniques that allowed for identifying suspects through family DNA matches, even when the perpetrator's own DNA was not in any database, further expanding the potential for solving cold cases. Dr. Marcus Wong, whose testimony had been instrumental in explaining the DNA evidence to the jury, became a sought-after consultant for cold case units throughout the Southeast, helping investigators identify which unsolved cases might benefit most from reanalysis using current technologies. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case was the renewed emphasis on properly preserving biological evidence from violent crimes, even when immediate analysis is not possible due to technological limitations or resource constraints. The foresight of Detective Lucas Moore and the evidence technicians who had carefully collected and stored the samples from the Adams Mills murder scene in 1995, despite lacking the means to fully analyze them at the time, had ultimately made justice possible decades later when science finally caught up with their intuitive understanding of the evidence's potential value. Police departments across the country developed more rigorous protocols for evidence preservation in unsolved cases, acknowledging that future technological advances might provide answers that current methods cannot, a direct response to the lessons learned from the Adams Mills case. In Savannah, the impact of the case's resolution resonated throughout the community, from the practical aspects of law enforcement procedures to the more intangible elements of collective memory and healing. The double murder had been a defining trauma for the city in 1995, shattering the sense of security in the historic district and creating fear that had lingered long after the initial media coverage faded. The identification and conviction of Dustin Moss, while reopening old wounds, also provided a sense of closure and vindication for the investigators who had never forgotten the case, and the community members who had kept the victims' memories alive through scholarships, memorial programs, and annual remembrances. The pediatric therapy dog program Lisa had established at St. Joseph's Hospital, which had been named in her memory and continued operating in the decades following her death, received an influx of donations and volunteer applications after the case's resolution, ensuring its continuation for generations to come. On the 27th anniversary of the murders, December 17, 2022, a permanent memorial was dedicated in Forsyth Park, featuring twin bronze benches inscribed with Lisa and Cole's names and brief descriptions of their lives and contributions to the community. The memorial included a small educational plaque describing how their case had eventually been solved through preserved DNA evidence and scientific advancement, serving as both a tribute to two lives cut short and a reminder of the enduring pursuit of justice that had finally prevailed despite the passage of time. At the dedication ceremony, attended by the victims' families, investigators who had worked the case across decades, and hundreds of community members, Richard Adams summed up the complex emotions of the moment in a brief but powerful statement. Today we remember not just how Lisa and Cole died, but how they lived, with compassion, purpose, and loyalty to those they loved. And we recognize that while justice delayed is painful, the truth cannot remain buried forever when good people refuse to abandon their search for answers. The final chapter of this long saga came not in a courtroom or at a formal ceremony, but in a small, private moment recorded in Captain Lucas Moore's personal journal 6 months after Moss's sentencing. Moore, who had carried the weight of the unsolved case throughout his career and into retirement before seeing it finally resolved, described visiting Bonaventure Cemetery alone on a spring morning, standing before the shared headstone of Lisa Adams and Cole Mills with its inscription about friendship, multiplying good and dividing evil. After decades of professional detachment, he allowed himself a moment of pure human connection to the victims he had never known in life, but whose justice he had pursued with unwavering dedication. "I told them it was over," he wrote, "that the person who took their lives has finally been held accountable, and that they are remembered not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as people who touched countless lives through their kindness, their service, and ultimately through the legacy of justice that bears their names. Some debts can never be fully repaid, some losses never completely healed. But today at least, standing in the gentle Savannah spring with the Spanish moss swaying above their resting place, it feels like a circle has finally closed.